Have you ever felt the walls of your own home closing in, not because of the world outside, but because of the people you love most? My name is Morgan Hayes, and if you've ever wondered what it's like to give everything for family, only to realize you were never really safe, this story might feel a little like yours too. I always thought my family was my anchor, my lifeline through every storm. But sometimes what looks like love is just a lesson waiting to unfold. Some betrayals are quiet, a missed birthday, a forgotten thank you, but others arrive like a lightning strike, sharp and impossible to ignore. My turning point came not in a moment of anger, but in the stillness that followed when I realized I had finally run out of ways to save everyone but myself. It was late, the kind of Colorado night that settles deep in your bones. I was at the kitchen table laptop humming, finishing another freelance deadline so my parents Richard and Janet could sleep in the guest room down the hall. The air still smelled faintly of chamomile tea. My sister April burst through the door, her eyes red and wild. I'd seen that look before, always followed by a storm, but I'd never seen her so desperate. She asked for $8,000, no demanded. For once, I said no. She snapped, her voice sharp enough to break glass. And then before I could move, scalding coffee arced across the counter, splattering my arm and the floor. My parents appeared in the doorway, silent. No one reached for me. No one told April to stop. In that moment, the line between family and foe blurred, and I understood with painful clarity that I was alone. Sometimes the breaking point isn't a single act of cruelty, but the realization that you have been giving yourself away piece by piece for years. That night, as I scrubbed coffee off the linoleum and listened to my family debate my fate in the next room, a cold truth settled in my kindness had become my weakness. I was the dependable one, the good daughter, the caretaker who paid the mortgage and kept everyone afloat. But that loyalty became a chain around my neck. April's voice cut through the door. "We decided, Morgan. You need to leave." I searched my parents' faces, but found only the silence of people who had already chosen sides. Betrayal is sharp, but silence is worse. In the emptiness that followed, I realized this was more than a bad night. It was the unraveling of every story I'd ever told myself about love. It's strange looking back how easy it is to miss the signs. The little things, April borrowing money and never returning it. Mom's guilt-laced sighs. Dad's silence whenever I tried to draw a boundary had stacked up brick by brick, until the house I called home was a fortress I could no longer enter. For years I made excuses. They're just stressed. Family is supposed to come first. But the night they asked me to leave, I understood that love built on fear and obligation isn't love at all. It's survival. And I was done surviving for everyone but myself. That was the moment, bruised and tired, that I decided to stop running from the truth and to start reclaiming my life, no matter how painful the cost. If I'm honest, the hardest part of leaving wasn't the suitcase or the silence, it was unpacking the memories that had glued me to my family for so long. People like to say blood is thicker than water, but what they rarely admit is how heavy that blood can become. I was always the reliable one, the peacemaker, the extra pair of hands that kept things running when everyone else stumbled. As a child, my role was quietly assigned. I was the listener, the fixer, the responsible daughter who swept up after April storms and steadied my parents when life got rough. Our home in the Denver suburbs was modest, but my sense of duty filled every room. Looking back, it's clear I confused love with obligation for most of my life, a mistake I think a lot of us make. I remember the summer I turned 17 when my father lost his job at the steel plant. Our savings vanished almost overnight, and the mortgage payment loomed like a shadow in every conversation. April disappeared into her room, lost in teenage defiance, but I found myself filling out job applications at the local library after school. I worked the register at a grocery store all summer, my feet aching just so I could slip $200 into my mother's purse when she wasn't looking. No one ever asked me to. I just knew deep down that holding us together was my responsibility. It's funny how quickly a child can become the family's silent safety net. I kept my head down, did my homework, and learned how to quiet my own needs so everyone else could breathe easier. There were birthdays when I handed April the biggest slice of cake even after she'd forgotten mine, and Christmas mornings when I pretended to love socks and secondhand sweaters because I saw how hard Mom tried to make magic out of almost nothing. When April flunked out of her first year in college, it was me who dipped into my tiny savings account to help her enroll again, telling myself that's just what sisters do. It wasn't a single grand sacrifice. It was 1,000 small ones, each invisible, and over time almost expected. I see now that my love language was fixing, and I gave it freely, rarely questioning what I got in return. As the years rolled on, my support only deepened. I worked 2 jobs in college, juggling freelance gigs and night shifts, always sending home a little extra just in case. When my mother's arthritis worsened and medical bills piled up, I took on more clients, sometimes missing sleep just to cover another round of prescriptions. My friends at the time couldn't understand why I never took spring break trips or splurged on myself. I always had an excuse ready. But the real reason was simple. I didn't know how to put myself first without feeling guilty. That's the trouble with being the family's strong one. No one stops to ask if you're okay. They assume you're built to carry it all, never realizing how heavy it gets. There's a saying I read once: sometimes being loyal is just another way to avoid the pain of change. For a long time, I clung to the hope that my sacrifices would eventually be recognized, that April and my parents would see me not just as a safety net, but as a person who deserved care too. I watched as my friends grew into adults who set boundaries with their families, carving out spaces of independence and self-respect. I envied their freedom even as I made excuses for my own situation. They need me more, I'd tell myself, and maybe that's just how families work. I never realized that love isn't supposed to feel like a debt that grows heavier with each passing year. One winter, April showed up on my doorstep with nothing but a suitcase and a story about her latest breakup. She cried in my arms, and I made her tea, telling her she could stay as long as she needed. That few weeks turned into months. She'd leave dirty dishes in the sink and call me Mother Morgan in that teasing tone. But beneath the jokes, I felt the old roles re-emerging. She needed rescuing, and I always answered the call. Our parents visited, often filling my living room with the hum of old grievances and half-hearted apologies. Still, I made space for them, buying extra groceries, budgeting for repairs, and listening to everyone's worries but my own. Looking back, I see how these moments shaped my idea of family, a tangle of support, guilt, and love that was never quite balanced. I don't think my parents or April set out to take me for granted. They just fell into the comfort of my reliability, never asking if I was tired or lonely or quietly resentful. I think this happens to a lot of families, especially in America, where we glorify the selfless caretaker, but rarely pause to consider what they might be losing. I wish someone had told me that boundaries are a kind of love too, not just for yourself, but for everyone involved. The world outside our front door never saw the cracks. To neighbors, we were the close-knit family who weathered every storm together. But inside, the weight of unspoken expectations pressed down year after year. I learned to smile through it, to let my own dreams shrink so others could expand. When April missed rent or lost another job, I covered for her. When my parents' home slipped into foreclosure, I moved them into mine, convinced that good daughters don't turn their backs. I believed with a kind of desperate hope that things would eventually even out, that maybe someone would return the favor when I needed it most. But that night in the kitchen, when April's anger boiled over and my parents refused to meet my eyes, the truth hit me harder than any insult ever could. I had made myself indispensable, but never irreplaceable. In their eyes, I was a resource, not a daughter, not a sister, but a solution to their problems. That realization stung. It wasn't just about money or space or even love. It was about how easily my needs had disappeared beneath theirs. Sometimes the hardest chains to break are the ones forged in kindness and worn in silence. If you've ever been the one who quietly holds everything together, the sibling who never complains, the child who always shows up, you might recognize the fatigue that comes from years of invisible labor. It can be easy to lose yourself in the process, to forget that your own happiness matters too. The lesson I'm still learning is that real love isn't transactional. It doesn't keep a scorecard or demand that you empty yourself to fill someone else. Love should feel like freedom, not obligation. And families, no matter how complicated, must make space for every member to be seen and valued, not just for what they provide, but for who they are. I wish I could say that realizing all this made it easy to walk away to put myself first for once. The truth is, change is messy. Even after I left, I spent nights wondering if I'd done the right thing, if I was selfish for drawing a line where none had existed before. But as the weeks passed, I started to see my life differently. Without the constant weight of everyone else's needs, I felt lighter, almost unfamiliar. I remembered the things that once brought me joy: long walks at sunset painting in the quiet mornings, the simple pleasure of choosing for myself. It wasn't always easy, but every step toward freedom was a step toward becoming whole. And so as I stepped into this uncertain chapter homeless, in every sense but surrounded for the first time by my own choices, I knew I was finally ready to ask a new question. What does a life look like when it's built not just for others but for yourself? I didn't have the answer yet, but I was determined to find it one small, imperfect act of self-love at a time. When people talk about family, they rarely mention the invisible strings, those subtle tugs of expectation, guilt, and duty that shape the way we love. I grew up believing my family's problems were my problems to solve. For years, I didn't see the pattern. Every time April made a mistake or my parents struggled, they turned to me not just for help but for rescue. At first, it felt good to be needed. Their thanks were warm, their relief genuine. But as time passed, I realized those gestures were only a thin blanket over something colder, a sense that my worth was tied to how much I could sacrifice. The trickiest part about being manipulated by your own family is how gentle it can seem. My mother's voice always softened when she asked for a small favor. She would say things like, "I don't know what we'd do without you," or "You're the only one we can trust." There were days I craved that approval, feeling a bittersweet pride each time I came through. But behind those words lingered another message: don't let us down. Whenever I hesitated, when I pushed back on a request, or asked for time to myself, her disappointment was thick as honey. I just thought family came first, she'd sigh, and I'd feel that old sting of shame settle in. It wasn't always obvious, but the guilt seeped in everywhere. April was the master of it. She knew just how to push my buttons. She'd show up unannounced, tears in her eyes, telling stories of heartbreak and misfortune. "You're so lucky to have it all together, Morgan," she'd say, making my stability sound like something I'd stolen from her. Sometimes her compliments felt like backhanded accusations. If I suggested she look for work or try therapy, her mood would flip. Easy for you to say, she'd snap. "You never had it as hard as me." For a long time, I believed her. I wondered if maybe I was cold or selfish, or simply too blind to see her pain. Looking back, I can see the ways I was gaslighted into doubting my own feelings. Whenever I brought up how tired I was, how overwhelmed, my parents would change the subject. "You're so strong, you always bounce back." If I tried to set boundaries, the conversation turned on me. "You don't care about family anymore," they'd ask, as if self-care was an act of betrayal. It's a subtle thing, this kind of manipulation. It rarely involves shouting or slammed doors. More often, it's a quiet erasure of your needs, a constant reminder that you must prove your love by saying yes. I remember a Thanksgiving dinner that captures it perfectly. The house was crowded, everyone jostling for a seat at the table. April arrived late, carrying nothing but her phone and a sad story about losing her wallet. My parents welcomed her with open arms, then asked if I could spot her for the meal just this once they promised. Later, as we cleaned up, Mom leaned close and whispered, "You're such a good daughter, always looking after your sister. She'd be lost without you." The praise felt good, but as I washed the dishes alone, I realized it came with a price. Each compliment was a little nudge: keep going, don't stop, don't let us down. It's not just my story. I know so many people who have been cast in the role of fixer or peacemaker in their families, especially eldest daughters, caretakers, the ones who quietly take on more than their share. In American families, we're taught that loyalty means self-sacrifice, that love means never saying no. But what no one warns you is that these patterns can become a kind of prison, locking you into a cycle of giving and guilt. The more you do, the more you're asked to do. It's a lesson I learned slowly, one difficult boundary at a time. One of the hardest moments came when I finally tried to say no. April had called late at night, asking if she could move in just for a few weeks. I'd already supported her through 2 breakups and a job loss that year. My apartment was small, my patients even smaller, but I hesitated, afraid of being seen as selfish. When I gently refused, she exploded. "You're all I have, Morgan. How can you turn your back on me?" Her words echoed through the phone, and I lay awake for hours questioning my decision. Was I really that heartless? Or was I finally learning to protect myself? The truth is, boundaries are hard for people like us. We're used to love as something earned, not given freely. We think saying yes will keep the peace, but it only deepens the imbalance. What I wish I'd known sooner is this: love can survive a no. Healthy families can handle disappointment, respect boundaries, and still find their way back to each other. If every act of kindness comes with an expectation, it's not kindness, it's currency. That realization didn't come all at once. It arrived slowly in moments when I noticed the cost of constant giving. I saw how my health suffered, how my dreams shrank, how my friendships faded under the weight of family first. There were times when I felt like a ghost in my own life, invisible, except when needed. I began to ask myself hard questions. What if my love wasn't enough to fix them? What if I deserved the same care I gave away so freely? Each time I asked, the guilt lessened, and in its place, a quiet self-respect began to grow. Of course, my family didn't change overnight. When I started to set boundaries, they pushed back harder. Mom's tears, April's anger, Dad's silence, they all tried to pull me back into my old role. But with every no, I felt a little stronger. I found comfort in stories from friends who had walked the same path, who had learned to love their families without losing themselves. I started reading about generational patterns, about how emotional manipulation can become invisible if you're not looking for it. Each new insight was a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't alone or broken, just learning how to be whole. If there's one lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this: true love doesn't require you to disappear. You are allowed to have needs, to say no, to protect your peace. Boundaries are not walls. They're doors that let in only what you choose. In families, as in all relationships, respect must flow both ways. It's not selfish to want balance, it's necessary. And if those you love can't honor, that it says more about them than about you. As I moved through those difficult months, testing my new boundaries and reclaiming my time, I realized that guilt would always try to follow me. But guilt is not the same as love. It's just a habit, a well-worn path back to a life I'd outgrown. The real challenge was learning to forgive myself for the years I spent trying to be everything for everyone. In that forgiveness, I found a freedom I'd never known. It was around this time, as I pieced my life back together and learned to stand on my own, that an unexpected letter arrived, one that would challenge everything I thought I knew about family loyalty and hope. But that's another story. And it begins with the unopened envelope waiting on my kitchen counter and a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for a week before I dared to open it, but something else was gnawing at my mind. After months of growing distance and sharpened boundaries, I started noticing small inconsistencies, tiny shifts in my finances, and faint echoes of worry that wouldn't leave me alone. I'd always been careful with money, a lesson carved deep after years of watching my parents struggle, but lately, numbers didn't add up. The checking account I used for family expenses was draining faster than usual. At first, I brushed it off. Life was chaotic after all, and habits are hard to break. But as days passed, a chill of suspicion crept in, a feeling that the unraveling of trust wasn't just emotional, but financial too. One Saturday morning, I sat down with a cup of coffee and a heavy heart, determined to go through every statement line by line. I circled charges I didn't recognize, odd withdrawals, gift cards, and purchases from stores I never shopped at. My stomach tightened as I totaled the amounts. What started as a few $100s grew to thousands, then tens of thousands spread quietly over months. It was all so calculated, each transaction just small enough to escape notice. But together they told a story of someone siphoning my savings in the shadows. My breath caught as I realized this wasn't a stranger or some banking error. the pattern fit someone who knew my habits, who understood my trust. I wanted to believe it was a mistake. I called the bank hoping for an explanation, but the details matched perfectly my address, my name, my sister's favorite stores. I remembered April's casual offers to help with the bills, her late-night borrowing of my laptop, her flippant jokes about borrowing my card. There's a special kind of heartbreak that comes from being betrayed by the person you've spent years rescuing. I sat in the living room numb as the sunlight stretched across the floor, casting everything in sharp relief. My hands shook as I pulled out old text messages, piecing together the nights April crashed on my couch and the mornings after when I woke to receipts I didn't remember making. It's a scenario more common than most people want to admit. Financial abuse in families is rarely loud or obvious. It slips in through unlocked doors, joint accounts, emergency loans forgotten, Venmo payments, until you wake up one day to find your safety net has vanished. In America, I've read that nearly 1 in 5 adults has experienced some form of financial manipulation from a family member, whether it's a parent sibling or even a grown child. Sometimes it starts as a small favor. Can I use your card for groceries? I'll pay you back next week. But when the trust isn't returned, the debts grow and the silence thickens. Like me, too many people blame themselves, too embarrassed to admit what's happening behind closed doors. I called my friend Sam a lawyer because I needed someone outside the family web to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. Sam listened quietly as I laid out the evidence, the transfers, the purchases, the access April had to my life. She told me stories about her other clients, people who had lost everything because they ignored the red flags. "It's not your fault," she said gently. "You wanted to believe the best in your sister. That's not weakness, it's hope. But hope without boundaries can leave you broke." Her words hit hard, but they gave me something I desperately needed permission to act, to take my own pain seriously. I changed my passwords, froze my credit, and opened a new account. With every step, a small piece of myself came back quiet, but determined. I filed a police report, not because I wanted to see April in trouble, but because I needed to draw a line to say enough in a way that mattered. The shame was real, but so was the relief. I talked to a therapist about the mix of anger and sorrow I felt about how betrayal by family twists your understanding of love. She helped me see that my generosity wasn't the problem. It was the expectation that I would never say no. Still, the hardest part wasn't the money. It was discovering that April had gone further than I imagined. She'd reached out to my biggest clients, people who trusted me with their projects and their brands, claiming I was unstable and unreliable. She pitched herself as a more consistent alternative, sharing my portfolio and contact lists without my knowledge. Some clients emailed me quietly, asking if I was all right. Others simply faded away, uncomfortable with the mess. The loss wasn't just financial, it was personal, a slow erosion of the life I'd built from scratch. I kept thinking of all the times April had broken my things as a child, always blaming someone else. I thought we'd outgrown those games, but maybe some patterns are harder to break than I wanted to admit. There's a saying, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. I wish I'd believed it sooner, but it's human to hope to offer one more chance to believe that love can change people. If there's a lesson here, it's this: forgiveness doesn't require forgetting. Boundaries aren't punishments, they're life jackets when the water rises. In those weeks, I learned how quickly things can unravel. My savings were gone, my professional reputation bruised, and the family I'd tried so hard to protect had become my biggest threat. But with each small act of taking back control, calling the bank, reporting the fraud, telling my story to friends, I felt less like a victim and more like a survivor. The journey back to trust was going to be long and lonely, but at least I was finally walking it with open eyes. And then, just as I started to reclaim my sense of self, the envelope from Leonard resurfaced its weight, somehow heavier, now that I understood what family could take and what it might also give. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the return address, wondering if it would offer another blow or a path toward healing. Some letters change everything, not because of what they say, but because of what you're finally ready to see. With a deep breath, I tore it open, not knowing that the truth inside would challenge everything I thought I knew, not just about my family, but about myself and the meaning of loyalty. Losing my savings and my sense of safety was like stepping into winter with no coat, sudden raw and colder than I'd ever expected. I left the house that once felt like mine, carrying just a duffel bag and the echo of April's betrayal in my ears. I moved in with Liam, who lived in a one-bedroom apartment above an old record shop on Pearl Street. His place always smelled faintly of coffee and dust and secondhand vinyl. Liam offered me a kind of quiet I'd never known a place to land not to fix. But even in his warmth, my nerves twitched with guilt. How could I burden someone else when all I'd ever done was hold my own world up for others? It's strange how quickly you can feel like a guest in your own story, unsure if you have the right to need anything at all. Liam's way was gentle. He never rushed my words or brushed off my late-night silences. When he found me at the kitchen table one morning, head in my hands over another client's awkward goodbye, he only poured more coffee and sat beside me. "You don't have to explain," he said softly. "Let's just be tired together." That invitation, so small, so ordinary, felt revolutionary. For the first time, I let myself be cared for, even as shame nagged at me. Sometimes the bravest thing is to let someone see you unravel. We're so used to patching up our own holes, especially those of us who grew up believing love is something you earn by giving more, working harder, always smiling. Letting go of that belief was like learning to breathe a different kind of air. Days drifted by, but my mind never stopped racing. The loss, the humiliation, the hollow ache of being cast out by my own family, every emotion vied for space. I replayed old arguments in my head, desperate to spot the moment where I could have changed the outcome. Was there a sign I'd missed, a kindness I could have given, or a boundary I could have set that would have spared me all this pain? It's easy in the aftermath to believe you could have done better. I saw myself as both the villain and the victim, too soft, too blind, too stubborn. But with each day, Liam's steady presence reminded me healing doesn't happen by rewinding the past. It happens by allowing yourself to exist in the mess of right now and trusting that it's enough. I began to notice things I'd never let myself feel before. Simple pleasures like reading on the sunlit balcony or making pancakes for breakfast became small acts of reclamation. I started a journal, scribbling out the tangled knots inside me. Sometimes I'd write angry letters to April or my parents' letters I'd never send, but that let me name my pain. I went for long walks after sunset, letting the world get quiet enough that my own thoughts could finally breathe. And bit by bit, I found myself again not as the fixer or the strong one, but as someone allowed to be broken, flawed, and real. Still, it was hard to shake the habits of a lifetime. Even as I gained strength, guilt shadowed my steps. Every phone call I ignored from home, every invitation I turned down, every moment of rest felt like a betrayal of my old self. I worried what others would think, my friends, my colleagues, even Liam. Would they see me as weak as a burden or as someone finally learning to stand up for herself? I realized that in protecting my family for so long, I'd forgotten how to protect my own heart. I'd never let myself be the one who needed help. Now I had no choice but to accept the gift of support and to learn that asking for it was not defeat but courage. It helped to talk to others who'd walked a similar path. I joined an online support group for people recovering from toxic family ties. Their stories echoed mine, years of overgiving, misplaced loyalty, and the lonely work of rebuilding a life. One woman, a nurse from Ohio, wrote about how she'd finally stopped paying her brother's rent after 10 years. Another, a teacher from California, shared how she learned to let her phone go unanswered when her mother called with demands. Their stories, raw and vulnerable, taught me that setting boundaries isn't about closing doors. It's about opening a space for self-respect to bloom. I wasn't alone, and neither were they. I learned something vital in those long, uncertain weeks. Real love can handle no. Healthy relationships survive disappointment and even anger. They flex, recover, and grow. The kind of love that falls apart at the first sign of resistance isn't really love at all. It's control. I started to trust that the people who mattered would stay, even when I drew lines, and that the ones who only valued me for what I gave would drift away. With every small act of self-advocacy, saying no, choosing rest, letting someone else carry the weight, I reclaimed a little more of my life. But change is rarely linear. Some nights, grief crept in a sadness so deep, I wondered if I'd ever feel safe again. Sometimes I missed my family with a fierceness that made me forget all the reasons I'd left. I'd remember old laughter or the way Mom used to braid my hair on lazy Sunday mornings, and I'd ache for something soft and uncomplicated. But those memories, I realized, could exist alongside the truth. I could hold both love and pain, gratitude and anger, and let them shape me into someone wiser, not just someone wounded. Gradually, with Liam's encouragement and the quiet strength of my new community, I began to ask myself a different question. What if my voice mattered too? What if I could choose who I became, not in spite of what I'd lost, but because of it? The answer didn't come all at once, but with each tentative step, I moved a little closer to believing it. I started picking up freelance work again, cautiously reconnecting with clients who hadn't believed April's stories. I learned to tell the truth about what happened, about what I needed, and about what I wouldn't accept any longer. It was just as I began to imagine a future that belonged to me, not my family, not their expectations, but me, that I opened Leonard's letter. I sat at Liam's kitchen table, sunlight pooling around me, and unfolded the crisp paper inside. There was hope in its weight, and maybe a warning too. As I read the first few lines, I realized the story I thought had ended was only just beginning. Sometimes a single envelope can open a new door, not only to the past, but to the life you never believed you could claim. And as my heart pounded with equal parts fear and anticipation, I understood the time had come to discover what family freedom and forgiveness really mean. The letter from Leonard felt heavier than it looked, its edges worn, as if it had traveled a long way just to find me. For days I let it sit on the table, glancing at it over breakfast, or while I brushed past with a stack of laundry. I was afraid of what it might contain, afraid it would dredge up old wounds, or worse, offer a hope I was too tired to hold. When I finally opened it, the words spilled out gently but firmly written in Leonard's careful script. Morgan, I've always seen your strength. You deserve more than what you've been given. I leave you my house in Boulder, not as a gift, but as a new beginning. Do with it what you wish, but do it for you. I sat stunned, the paper trembling in my hands. The house in Boulder had always been a family legend, a rambling Victorian with creaking floors and stained glass windows. When I was little, I used to visit Leonard there, spending afternoons drawing in the sunroom while he listened to jazz and told me stories about the past. It was the only place I'd ever felt safe from the world, safe from the endless needs and noise of my family. Now that sanctuary belonged to me. But the news didn't come with pure joy. It came with the prickly awareness that my family would find out, and that old battles might be fought all over again. Still, I couldn't ignore the sense of hope that stirred inside me. For the first time in years, I could picture a life on my own terms with a roof over my head that wasn't tied to the strings of obligation. But suspicion lingered too, like a shadow. I wondered if there were legal hurdles, secret debts, or hidden catches. I called Leonard's lawyer, who reassured me that the will was airtight, my inheritance was secure. Yet even then, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, bracing for April or my parents to challenge my right to something of my own. I started making lists, practical ones at first. What repairs would the house need? Could I afford the taxes? But my thoughts wandered quickly to dreams. What could I create in that space? An art studio? A writing room? Maybe a garden where I could finally plant something and watch it grow. The idea of belonging somewhere, even for a little while, felt almost revolutionary. I called Liam and told him the news. He grinned through the phone, his pride evident in every word. This is your time, Morgan. You get to decide what happens next. Still fear tugged at me. I'd lived my whole life on the edge of other people's needs, always ready to surrender what was mine to keep the peace. The thought of holding on to something, especially something this big, felt almost selfish. My mother used to say, "We're only as happy as our unhappiest child." For years, I took that to mean my joy should always be second to April's struggles or my parents' disappointments. Now, for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I put my own happiness first. I drove up to Boulder on a windy Saturday, my heart pounding with anticipation and dread. The house stood just as I remembered, paint peeling in places, the porch swing creaking softly, sunlight spilling in through dusty panes. I let myself inside, feeling both like an intruder and a long-lost child coming home. I wandered through the empty rooms, letting my fingers trail along banisters and window ledges, listening to the echo of Leonard's laughter in the halls. I thought of all the stories he'd shared, his gentle reminders that I was enough just as I was. Each step settled something restless inside me. As I explored, I found small reminders of Leonard everywhere, a worn book of poetry on the windowsill, a scarf draped over the arm of a chair, a photo of us from years ago. Each item was an invitation to remember that family could be chosen and that kindness didn't have to cost your soul. I realized then that Leonard had given me more than a house. He'd given me permission to imagine a different life, to believe that it wasn't just okay, but necessary to build something beautiful from the pieces of what was broken. Of course, reality set in quickly. The house needed repairs, and my bank account was still fragile after months of chaos. I made appointments with contractors, sorted through old paperwork, and started budgeting in earnest. There were moments of panic, especially when I heard from the lawyer that my family had been notified of the inheritance. My mother left tearful voicemails, April sent angry texts, and my father wrote a stilted letter accusing me of turning my back on what really matters. Each message felt like a tug back toward old patterns. But I was different now. I was learning, however slowly, to let guilt pass through me like a summer storm, intense but temporary. I leaned on the lessons of the past year, remembering how quickly joy could be taken when you weren't careful. I knew I'd have to fight to keep my new life intact, not just against my family's demands, but against the small voice inside me that still whispered I didn't deserve it. I looked for inspiration in the stories of others, people who had started over after loss, who had learned to value themselves, not for what they could give, but for who they were. I read memoirs of artists who found healing in unexpected places and let their resilience fuel my own. If there was a lesson in all of this, it was that hope isn't naive, it's brave. It takes courage to start again, to imagine that after everything, you might still create a life worth loving. Leonard's gift was more than bricks and mortar. It was the belief that I could do hard things and still come out whole. That belief was tested sooner than I expected. Just as I began to settle in to picture a future in those sunlit rooms, a letter arrived from April's lawyer. The envelope was thick, stamped with threats of a family lawsuit, the old game starting all over again. My heart pounded, but this time something had changed. I stood in the entryway, letter in hand, and reminded myself I belonged here. This was my story now, and I was ready to defend it. The fight for my future and for the meaning of family was only just beginning. There's a particular ache that settles in when you realize the fight for your future will not be waged quietly in your heart, but loudly in the open for all to see. The lawsuit wasn't just paperwork. It was the beginning of a new kind of battle, one where every hurt, every memory, every unspoken rule of family was up for public inspection. April and my parents claimed I was unfit, that my inheritance from Leonard was the result of undue influence. Their lawyer painted me as unstable, irresponsible, and even cruel, a woman who'd abandoned her family for greed. It was surreal seeing words about myself that didn't fit, like wearing someone else's old coat. But if the past months had taught me anything, it was that silence is its own kind of consent. I had to speak even if my voice trembled. Preparing for court was nothing like the shows on TV. No rousing speeches or last-minute confessions, just hours of paperwork, phone calls, and waiting. My lawyer, Sam, was methodical and kind. She walked me through every accusation, helping me gather evidence of my stability, my work, and my long history of supporting my family. She reminded me that being a good daughter had never required emptying myself out. We built our case not on anger, but on truth emails, bank records, text messages, and testimony from friends and colleagues who had witnessed my journey. Some days, the evidence felt empowering. Other days, it felt like putting my entire life on display. I found solace in small rituals, a morning walk in Leonard's overgrown garden, coffee with Liam at sunrise, and quiet evenings writing down what I still believed about family despite everything. April, always the performer, took the stand with tears in her eyes. She spoke of her struggles, her pain, and how lost she felt without me. My mother wrung her hands, describing a version of our life that was half memory, half myth. My father sat stone-faced, answering questions with practiced monotony. There were moments I pitied them, caught in their old patterns, unable or unwilling to imagine another way. But there was also anger, sharp and righteous, at the stories they spun and the pain they were willing to inflict just to keep me in my old role. During cross-examination, Sam revealed the web of financial manipulation, the unauthorized bank transfers, the client poaching, and April's repeated history of exploiting my trust. We presented the evidence methodically, never raising our voices, never resorting to personal attacks. I watched as the judge sifted through the facts, her expression unreadable. What struck me most was the difference between truth and perception. In our private lives, stories grow wild, reshaped by need, fear, and habit. But in that courtroom, stripped of emotional fog, patterns emerged that could not be denied. Family drama, I realized, looks very different under fluorescent lights. One afternoon, I found myself waiting in the courthouse hallway, heart pounding in my chest. A woman about my mother's age sat beside me, thumbing through a worn paperback. She offered a tired smile and said, "You're not alone, you know. Sometimes the hardest thing is believing your pain is real." She told me her own story, years of caretaking a brother who sued for their father's house, the loneliness of holding the line when no one else will. Her words were a balm, a reminder that my story was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a larger pattern. So many families across America come undone over inheritance and old wounds. I began to see my struggle not as a personal failure, but as part of a bigger lesson about boundaries, love, and letting go. The hearing itself was both brief and excruciating. When I took the stand, I was surprised by how calm I felt. I spoke quietly, honestly about my love for my family, the years of sacrifice, and my hope that one day we could find our way back to one another. But I also named the harm, refusing to minimize the betrayal or the cost. "You can't keep giving from an empty cup," I said. "You can't call something love when it leaves you less than whole." I watched April's face tighten, saw the confusion in my mother's eyes, and felt finally the power of saying what needed to be said. The judge ruled in my favor. My inheritance from Leonard was upheld. The evidence of financial abuse was undeniable, and the court recognized my right to set boundaries, even with the people who once called me home. Relief washed over me, but so did a strange, hollow sadness. The victory was necessary, but it came at a price, the final breaking of old illusions, the certainty that things would never go back to how they once were. Afterward, I stood outside the courthouse, the air sharp and bright. Liam met me on the steps, wrapping me in a hug that said more than words ever could. We walked to a nearby cafe where I sipped tea and let myself feel the exhaustion and relief. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for the next disaster. I was allowed to be still, to trust that the worst had passed. I learned a crucial lesson in those days: defending your truth is rarely comfortable, but it is always necessary. The courtroom wasn't just a place to prove my case. It was a crucible that burned away the last remnants of doubt. I could survive loss and still be whole. I could love my family and still say no. And I could begin to imagine a future that was mine alone. But as the dust settled, another question began to stir in my heart. A question about Leonard, about the secrets the old house in Boulder still held, and about a mystery I'd tried for years to ignore. Sometimes the end of one battle is just the beginning of a deeper search for truth. And as I turned the key in Leonard's door that evening, I felt a new chapter unfolding, even as the scars of the old one remained. The Boulder house had always carried a sense of mystery, but after the trial, its quiet corners felt even more haunted. I found myself drawn to the study at dusk, where Leonard used to sit with a book and his thoughts. The air was thick with dust and memory. I began to sort through boxes left behind, hoping to find the last pieces of paperwork for the estate. Instead, I discovered a slim weathered journal and a stack of letters tied with twine, and Leonard's careful handwriting. I recognized Ben's name on several envelopes, Ben, my fiancé, whose loss still pulsed like an old bruise. Grief is odd. It never quite disappears, only tucks itself behind daily life, waiting for a scent, a sound, or in this case, a handwritten note to call it forward. My hands trembled as I opened the first letter. It was dated 2 months before Ben's accident. His words were full of love and hope for our future, but beneath the surface a thread of unease unraveled. Ben had written about a discovery he'd made while helping my family with some tax documents. He worried aloud about inconsistencies in the numbers, money unaccounted for, explanations that didn't add up. "I know you trust them, Morgan," he wrote, "but something's not right. I just want to protect you." Reading those lines, my chest tightened. I remembered how Ben had tried to talk to me about concerns that spring, but I'd brushed him off, not wanting to believe my family could ever cross such lines. The journal told more of the story. Leonard and Ben had exchanged notes in secret, sharing suspicions and gathering evidence. There were copies of emails, diagrams of money trails, and even a list of questions Ben intended to ask my parents. The last entry chilled me. "Meeting with Richard tomorrow by the bridge. He's finally agreed to talk." That was the night Ben died. His car veering off the road, ruled an accident by police, but always leaving a quiet question in my heart. Now, reading their correspondence, I couldn't ignore the possibility that his death had not been as simple or random as I'd believed. I spent days in a fog piecing together the timeline, reading and rereading each document. The facts pointed toward a devastating truth. Ben's pursuit of honesty may have put him in danger, not just from strangers, but from people I loved. I confronted my mother in a phone call, unable to hold back the torrent of pain and accusation. She broke down in tears, denying any direct involvement, but admitting they'd met with Ben that night, angry and afraid he would ruin everything. My father, in a letter, simply wrote, "We never meant for things to go so far." There are moments in life when reality fractures, when the people you love become strangers on the other side of a line you can't uncross. What do you do with that kind of grief? Grief that is half mourning, half betrayal. I went on long walks, retracing old routes Ben and I had shared, searching for comfort in the rhythm of my footsteps. I spoke with Leonard's lawyer, who encouraged me to bring the evidence to authorities not just for closure, but for justice. My therapist reminded me that seeking truth is not about revenge, but about giving pain a name so it doesn't fester in darkness. I told Liam the whole story, my shame and sorrow spilling out, and he simply held me, repeating, "You didn't cause this, Morgan. You couldn't have known." It's easy when tragedy strikes to look for someone to blame, often that someone becomes yourself. I replayed every conversation I'd had with Ben that year, wishing I had listened more, doubted sooner, loved better. But shame, I learned, is just another form of grief, a way to stay tethered to the past. Instead, I tried to honor Ben by seeking the whole story, not just the pieces that hurt less. With the help of the lawyer and the police, we opened an investigation. There were difficult days, interviews, paperwork, waiting, and worst of all, imagining what Ben must have felt in his final hours. Yet beneath it all, a sense of resolve took root. If I could not save him, maybe I could save myself by facing the truth, no matter how painful. In America, we're taught to prize loyalty, to keep family secrets, and move on. But some secrets can only breed more suffering. I thought of all the families like mine, bound together by silence, pretending that love could paper over old wounds. But real love, I saw now, requires honesty. It demands we tell the truth even when it fractures the stories we built our lives around. The lesson was clear. Some chapters must close before new ones can begin. With every step toward the truth, I began to reclaim a little more of myself. I could not undo the past or restore what was lost, but I could choose to stop hiding from pain. I could choose, as Leonard had done, to stand up for what mattered, even when it meant standing alone. That choice didn't erase the hurt, but it offered something like hope. The investigation would take time, but I felt less alone, anchored by the memory of Ben's courage and Leonard's trust in me. As autumn settled over Boulder and the old house creaked in the wind, I realized that healing is not a destination, but a path. Some days I moved forward, some days I circled back, but always I chose honesty over comfort. And as news of the investigation reached my family, I braced for what would come next, a reckoning not just for them, but for the parts of myself I was finally ready to set free. There are truths that shatter, but there are also truths that mend. My journey was no longer just about survival. It was about finding meaning even in the darkness and carrying Ben's light, however quietly, into the next chapter. There's a quiet after storm, a hush that settles in, once the shouting, the courtroom drama, and the police interviews fade away. That's when you finally face yourself. For months, I'd braced for every phone call, every letter, every bit of news from Boulder's investigators. When the dust finally settled, there was no sense of triumph, only a bittersweet exhaustion. The authorities confirmed what Leonard and Ben had tried to uncover: years of financial deceit, and a cover-up that reached further than I'd ever dreamed. My family would face the consequences of their actions. My inheritance was secure, my name finally cleared, but the sense of loss was real, gnawing at the corners of every victory. Justice, I learned, doesn't always fill the holes left by grief. In the weeks after I wandered the Boulder house, letting silence echo through its hallways. Sometimes I'd stand at the window in Leonard's study and watch golden leaves tumble to the ground, thinking of all that had fallen in my life. The old me, the fixer, the peacemaker, the woman who thought she could save everyone, was gone. In her place was someone both more fragile and strangely stronger. I began to understand that healing wasn't about going back to what once was. It was about letting go gently of what could never be again. Healing is a word that's thrown around easily, but in truth, it's the hardest work I've ever done. It was uncomfortable at first unpacking, not just my family's betrayals, but my own patterns, my own choices. My therapist called it grieving the fantasy. I grieved the dream of a family that would someday change the fantasy that loyalty could earn me love, or that sacrifice would finally be returned. Letting go of those hopes hurt, but it was also a relief, like setting down a burden I'd carried too long. For the first time, I gave myself permission to mourn, not just for Ben, but for every version of myself that had tried and failed to hold everything together. Community helped too. I kept going to my support group, listening to others share stories of loss and renewal. One woman spoke about forgiving a parent who'd gambled away her college fund. Another described her path to peace after leaving a marriage rooted in control. Their courage gave me hope. If they could find light after such darkness, maybe I could too. I told my own story, voice trembling, and felt the knot in my chest loosen a little more each time. Sometimes healing looks like therapy and tears. Sometimes it's as simple as sitting in a circle of strangers and realizing you're not alone. I tried new routines, small and ordinary, to ground myself in the present. I painted the sunroom lemon yellow, filling it with plants and sketches of wildflowers. I took long walks by the creek, letting the rhythm of my feet anchor me when thoughts threatened to spiral. Liam and I created rituals: Friday night dinners, Sunday morning hikes, ways to mark time and remember that joy, though fragile, could still be found. Every day was a choice to dwell on the ruins or to build something new, no matter how slow the progress. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't always about the people who hurt you. Sometimes it's about forgiving yourself. I forgave myself for not seeing the signs, for loving too much, for trusting too easily. I forgave the younger me who believed she could fix everything, and the older me who finally realized she couldn't. It was a quiet, gradual thing, not a grand epiphany, but a daily practice. Each morning I'd whisper, "You did the best you could with what you knew." With time, the words began to feel true. I also forgave my family in my own way. Not because they apologized or changed, but because I refused to let their actions dictate the rest of my story. Forgiveness didn't mean reconciling or forgetting. It meant choosing freedom over bitterness, opening my hands, and letting go of the rope that tied me to the past. There were days when anger flared, when I replayed every injustice, every sharp word. But as the weeks turned to months, the pull grew weaker. What remained was not the pain, but the lesson. If there's one truth I want to pass on, it's this: healing is not linear. Some days you'll feel strong, ready to take on the world. Other days, the old sadness will sneak in, and that's okay. The point is not to erase your scars, but to honor them, to see them as proof that you survived and that you can begin again. The gift of choice is the greatest gift of all. You can choose what you carry forward and what you finally set down. As spring neared, I found myself dreaming of new beginnings. The Boulder house, once a place of shadows and secrets, began to feel lighter. I started to imagine it not just as a refuge for myself, but as a place for others who needed healing. A haven for those who, like me, were learning to rebuild. The idea grew roots at community center, an art studio, a space for people to tell their stories and find connection. It felt bold and a little terrifying, but also right. I reached out to local organizations floating the vision. The response was immediate and hopeful proof that even in a world full of heartbreak, new chapters can be written together. One afternoon, I found an old photograph of Ben and Leonard laughing on the front porch. For the first time in years, I didn't feel a wave of sorrow. Instead, I felt gratitude for their love, for their courage, for the chance to keep their memory alive in something good. I realized that honoring them meant more than justice or revenge. It meant living a life that reflected their values, honesty, kindness, and a willingness to start over, no matter how daunting. So when I stood in the sunroom, sketchbook in hand and plans on the table, I knew the story wasn't over. It was transforming, blooming into something neither grief nor betrayal could destroy. The hardest journeys can lead to the brightest places. And as I looked out at the wild Colorado sky, I felt the first real flutter of hope in a long, long time, ready for the final chapter where pain is transformed and possibility finally has room to grow. Sometimes the ending of one story is really just the beginning of another. As spring warmed the windowsills of the old Boulder house, I found myself surrounded by reminders of the journey photos of Leonard and Ben, sketches from my healing sunroom, old court documents now tucked away in drawers. Each one was a marker of loss, but also of growth. Looking back, I realized how every hardship had shaped me, the years of unseen sacrifice, the pain of betrayal, the unraveling of old loyalties, and the slow, deliberate path to healing. Each piece belonged, even the broken ones, and together they made something new. With the past no longer holding me hostage, I poured my energy into transforming Leonard's house into a haven for others. The art studio filled with color and laughter, the garden bloomed again, and the sunroom hosted workshops where people could share their stories without fear or shame. Survivors of family wounds, dreamers starting over, young people struggling to find their voices, all found a place here. The community we built was living proof that what nearly breaks us can also bind us together in hope. Every painting on the wall, every hand in the soil was a testament to the truth. We are more than the worst thing that's ever happened to us. Of course, the old scars remained. Grief still arrived in unexpected waves at the sight of a familiar coffee mug or in the quiet of a late afternoon. There were days when forgiveness seemed just out of reach, when anger and sadness threatened to undo the progress I'd made. But those feelings no longer defined me. I learned to let them move through, leaving space for gratitude and new dreams. The lesson was simple but powerful. We cannot change the past, but we can choose how it shapes our future. Healing isn't about forgetting. It's about reclaiming what was stolen and daring to imagine what comes next. What surprised me most was how the act of helping others healed parts of me I didn't even know were broken. I saw pieces of myself in every story shared at the foundation, every person who walked through those doors with burdens to lay down. I watched strangers become friends, watched hope flicker and grow, watched wounds slowly close, not because pain vanished, but because it was honored and spoken aloud. Together, we created a new kind of family, one built on understanding, honesty, and the freedom to begin again. If there's one message I want you to carry with you, it's this. No matter how deep your wounds or how dark your story feels, there is always the possibility of light. You are not alone. Your voice matters. Your healing can become someone else's hope. If my journey has touched you, if you see a piece of your own story in mine, I invite you to join this circle of resilience and renewal. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories of survival, forgiveness, and finding purpose after pain. Like this video if you believe in the power of second chances. And please share your thoughts or your own journey in the comments below. Your words might be the spark that helps someone else take their first brave step. Together, let's build a community where no one has to heal in silence, and every ending can bloom into a new beginning.